Join me inside my writing yurt. Come on. Hi, and welcome to Ask Cozy Grammar. I'm Thomas, and I'm excited to answer the questions you have sent in about grammar, punctuation, spelling, and writing, and creativity more generally. We have a lot of interesting questions, so I'd like to jump right in. Our first question comes from Sophia R. This is a question she had asked for our last session. We ran out of time, so I'm glad to start with it today. Sophia asks what I think is a very important question. What are active voice and passive voice? We often hear the advice to write using the active voice, but if we don't know what active voice is or passive voice is, it can be quite confusing. So let me see if I can explain it in the simplest step-by-step way. Active voice and passive voice are simply two different ways of using verbs in a sentence. For example, active voice shows clearly who or what is doing an action. You can hear it in the word action. Action has to do with what is being active, and the active voice is about that activity, that action. I'll give you an example. I lit the fire. Here we have a sentence in which it's very clear who did what. Who lit the fire? I lit the fire. Here's another example. I welcomed the guests into the writing yurt. Once again, it's clear who did what. Who welcomed the guests? I welcomed the guests. Now, passive voice, by contrast, turns our attention to the action rather than the actor. The actor becomes passive, if you will, and in fact can often disappear from the sentence entirely. Let me give you an example. I already shared the sentence with you, I lit the fire. That's in the active voice. Here's that same idea using the passive voice. The fire was lit. Notice how this sentence puts the emphasis on the action of the fire being lit and doesn't tell us who lit the fire. Here's another example. I welcomed the guests into the writing yurt. That was our active voice. Here's the same idea with passive voice. The guests were welcomed into the writing yurt. Notice that we know what happened. The guests were welcomed. Who welcomed them? We don't know. The sentence doesn't say. Now notice how the active voice is always clear about the actor, and the passive voice is much more ambiguous, much less clear, and in fact can even seem a bit dishonest. In passive voice, we have to add by whom to know who did the action. I'll give you an example. The fire was lit by Thomas, or the fire was lit by me. The guests were welcomed into the writing yurt by me. We can add by me or by whoever to show who is doing the action, but notice how the sentence starts to get longer and longer and more convoluted. It loses that crispness. It loses that clarity. And this is why writers often advise people to use the active voice instead of the passive voice. And I also believe this is very good advice. The active voice keeps us honest. The active voice helps our writing become more clear and more direct. Of course, there are times when it does make sense to use the passive voice. It's part of our language. It's part of the toolbox, if you will, of English. And there are times when it's perfectly acceptable. However, if we make a habit of preferring the active voice to the passive voice, I think that we'll find that our writing takes on more energy and more life. So that's how I would answer your question, Sophia, about what is active voice and what is passive voice. I hope that has helped to answer your question. Feel free to reach out if you want any clarification, and I can respond to you directly, or we can even do another segment on our next call. So that's what is active voice and what is passive voice.